Some cities are built for no one. From afar, they shine with perfect buildings, wide streets, and neat parks. Streetlights glow over empty sidewalks. Flags move in the wind with no one watching. They look alive until you step inside and hear nothing. It's not just about the silence, it's about the purpose behind it. Some of these cities are bait, some are stalled dreams, and some are relics of disaster. Each has a story written in its empty streets. This is the city where no one lives. In the 1950s, not long after the Korean War ended, North Korea built a village in the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ. The DMZ is a narrow strip of land that separates North and South Korea. The village is called Kijong-dong. On maps and in official North Korean statements, it is a thriving farming community. In reality, it has no permanent residents. It is known as the propaganda village, a place designed to send a message to the other side rather than serve the people who live there. The idea was to create a scene of prosperity visible from South Korea. Kijong-dong sits within sight of the border, so people with binoculars or telescopes in the south can see it. The buildings look clean and modern from a distance. The roofs are painted bright colors. The walls are fresh and without signs of wear. The streets appear neat and well kept. To someone viewing it from far away, it could look like a model town where families might live in comfort. The North Korean government hoped this would make South Koreans curious or even jealous. In theory, some might be tempted to cross over and join what they believed was a better life. Up close, the picture changes. The buildings are just shells. Many have no glass in the windows. There are no real rooms inside. The paint is kept fresh, but the interiors are empty. The only people who go into the buildings are maintenance crews. The town has no shops, no working farms, and no signs of normal daily life. No one hangs laundry. No children walk to school. No one lines up at a market. There is no smell of cooking or sound of conversation. At night, lights turn on in the windows. This is meant to suggest that people live there. But the lights are controlled by timers. They go on and off at set hours, the same pattern every day. Someone watching from the south might see the lights and think families are having dinner or relaxing in their homes. In reality, the rooms behind those windows are bare concrete. Loudspeakers once played patriotic music and speeches across the border from Kijong-dong. The broadcasts praised North Korean leaders, promised a better future, and criticized the South. They went on for hours at a time, and the sound carried far into the DMZ. These broadcasts were part of the same message. Life in the North is strong, happy, and united. The hope was to wear down morale on the other side and convince some to defect. South Korea responded in its own way. On its side of the DMZ, it built a large flagpole in a village called Daeseong-dong. In reply, North Korea built an even taller flagpole in Kijong-dong. For years, the two sides competed over who could build the tallest. Today, the flag in Kijong-dong still stands high above the empty streets, a visible statement of pride and power. Satellite images have helped strip away the illusion. Modern satellites can capture details clear enough to show the lack of activity. Analysts have studied years of images and seen the same clues repeated. Shadows reveal that some buildings have no floors. Patterns in the streets show almost no vehicle movement. Cropland appears unworked. Even changes in the light and color of roofs over time can show when fresh paint has been applied without other signs of use. From above, the image is still neat and orderly, but it is also static, as if frozen in time. If Kijong-dong were a real village, the images would show variation. Fields would change with the seasons. Roads would have tire tracks or patches of repair. Rooftops might collect debris or weather marks. There would be signs of daily work, like carts, tools, and people. Instead, Kijong-dong remains staged, the same basic scene from decade to decade, with only minor changes made to keep it looking fresh from a distance. The existence of such a place shows how the Cold War atmosphere shaped life on the Korean peninsula. Both sides used symbols as much as weapons. The DMZ itself is heavily guarded, and direct contact between the two sides is rare. Propaganda has always been a tool to bridge that gap with images and messages. For North Korea, Kijong-dong was one way to project an image of strength and success without allowing outsiders to see the reality of life inside the country. Imagine someone living in a South Korean border village in the 1960s. They might climb a small hill with a pair of binoculars and look north. They would see Kijong-dong's clean streets and fresh buildings. Without more information, they might believe it was a community like their own, maybe even better. But over time, more people came to doubt what they were seeing. Refugees from the north described the truth. Military observers noted the lack of real activity. As technology improved, the truth became harder to hide. Yet the village still stands, kept in place by habit, tradition, and the fact that it still serves a symbolic role. Even if fewer people believe the illusion, it is a visible reminder of how the two Koreas remain divided. The DMZ is not just a military line, but also a stage where each side tries to present its version of reality. In that setting, Kijong-dong continues to play its part. The contrast between what the eye sees and what is real is sharp. A painted wall can look like wealth. A timed light can look like a warm home. From far away, those signals can be persuasive if the viewer wants to believe them. But distance also makes it easier to hide the details that would break the illusion. That is why Kijong-dong was placed where it is, close enough to be seen, far enough to prevent a clear view. Today, most people who study the DMZ know the truth about Kijong-dong. Tourists who visit observation posts in South Korea can look through mounted binoculars and see it for themselves. Guides explain that the buildings are empty and the lights are fake. Satellite photographs are shown on screens, pointing out the details that reveal the deception. But the village is still maintained, the paint is still fresh, and the flag still flies above it. In a place where appearances have long been a part of strategy, that may be reason enough to keep it as it is. In the early 2000s, China was in the middle of rapid economic growth. Cities were expanding at a pace the world had never seen. In Inner Mongolia, the local government of Ordos decided to build a new district from the ground up. It would be called Kangbashi. The plan was ambitious. It was designed for more than 1 million people, with wide boulevards, modern apartment blocks, office towers, cultural centers, and parks. Everything would be new, clean, and built to signal wealth and progress. The location was not random. Ordos had grown rich from coal mining and other natural resources. The city's income gave it money to invest in development. Local leaders saw Kangbashi as a chance to turn that wealth into a lasting symbol. They wanted to build a city that could attract skilled workers, business investment, and tourism. It would be a modern showcase in a region that had long been rural. Construction moved fast. Large housing estates rose in neat rows. Government buildings with grand designs appeared. There were wide public squares, museums, and a library shaped like stacked books. Schools, theaters, and sports facilities were added. The streets were broad enough to handle heavy traffic. From above, the layout was ordered and symmetrical, designed to impress visitors and potential investors. Yet when the buildings were finished, few people came. Apartments were bought, but most stayed empty. The wide streets had little traffic. The parks were well kept but empty of children. Shops had no customers. For years, Kangbashi was called a ghost city by outside media. The term meant a place built for a population that never arrived. One reason was that housing prices were high compared to average incomes in the region. Many of the apartments were bought not by people planning to live there, but by investors. They saw property as a safe way to store wealth, expecting prices to rise. Owning an empty apartment was common in China during this time, especially among the middle class in growing cities. The belief was that property values would keep climbing, so there was no rush to rent or sell. Another reason was that Ordos already had an older urban center where most people lived and worked. Moving to Kangbashi meant leaving established neighborhoods, businesses, and schools. For many residents, the new district felt too far from their daily lives. Even though it was only a short drive away, it lacked the familiarity and convenience of the old city. The overbuilding in Kangbashi was part of a broader trend in China during the boom years. Local governments relied on land sales to fund their budgets. Selling land to developers brought in quick revenue. Developers, in turn, built large projects to meet both real housing demand and speculative buying. In some cases, the pace of building ran far ahead of the actual number of people ready to move in. Kangbashi became one of the most visible examples because it was built so quickly and on such a large scale. Walking through parts of Kangbashi in the late 2000s could feel strange. You could stand on a wide boulevard lined with modern towers and not see another person for minutes at a time. Streetlights would turn on over empty intersections. Public art and sculptures decorated plazas without any visitors. The infrastructure was there, but the human activity that makes a city feel alive was missing. By the 2010s, local officials began trying to change this. They moved government offices from the old city to Kangbashi, forcing employees to work there and spend more time in the new district. Schools and universities were encouraged to set up campuses. Efforts were made to draw businesses, especially in service and cultural industries. Some cultural events were staged in Kangbashi's large venues to bring in visitors. These steps had some effect. The population started to grow, though it was still far below the original capacity. Schools filled with students whose parents worked in the relocated government departments. Cafes and small shops opened near office areas. The streets became busier, though there were still stretches that looked empty. Apartment blocks that had stood dark at night began to show more lights in their windows. Even so, filling Kangbashi was a slow process. Much of the housing was still in the hands of owners who treated it as an investment rather than a home. Some apartments were bought by people from outside the region who never intended to live there. Others were kept empty in hopes of selling at a higher price later. This meant that even if demand for housing grew, many units remained locked away from the rental market. Satellite images showed the changes over time. In the early years, photos captured completed buildings with little sign of use. No parked cars, no laundry hanging from balconies, no visible street activity. Later images revealed more signs of life, such as traffic, landscaping changes, and construction of new public facilities. Still, large areas looked underused compared to their size. The story of Kangbashi reflects both the ambition and the risks of China's urban expansion during the boom years. On one hand, it showed the ability to plan and build modern infrastructure quickly. On the other, it revealed what can happen when speculation outruns real demand. A city without enough residents feels incomplete, no matter how well it is built. Someone visiting Kangbashi for the first time might be impressed by its clean lines and modern design. They might see the museums, theaters, and sculptures and think it is a thriving place. But a longer stay would reveal the gaps. Whole blocks with no open businesses, apartment towers with dark windows, and quiet streets that seem built for a future that has not yet arrived. The emptiness is not absolute, but it stands out against the scale of what was built. In recent years, more Chinese cities have faced similar issues, though not always on the same scale. The government has taken steps to manage speculation, including rules to discourage buying homes only as investments. For Kangbashi, the challenge has been to turn a planned city into a lived-in city. That process depends not just on buildings, but on jobs, schools, and the everyday connections that make people want to stay. For now, Kangbashi remains partly in transition. It is no longer the silent, empty district that first drew attention in the early 2010s, but it is also not yet the fully populated urban center it was meant to be. It stands as a reminder that building a city is not the same as creating one that people choose to call home. In 2007, on the outskirts of Hangzhou in China's Zhejiang province, developers began work on an unusual project. They called it Tianducheng. The idea was to create a luxury residential area modeled after Paris. At the center of the plan stood a steel replica of the Eiffel Tower, about one-third the height of the real one in France. Around it, the streets and buildings copied Parisian architecture, with cream-colored facades, mansard roofs, and wrought iron balconies. Wide boulevards were lined with fountains and statues inspired by French landmarks. The project promised a taste of Europe in eastern China, aimed at wealthy buyers who wanted something different from the usual high-rise apartments. From the start, Tianducheng was designed as more than a small theme development. The plan included housing for tens of thousands, parks, gardens, and public squares meant to mirror the romantic image of Paris. Marketing materials showed couples walking hand in hand down tree-lined avenues, families enjoying picnics near the Eiffel Tower replica, and residents sipping coffee at sidewalk cafes. It was meant to blend luxury living with a fantasy of French culture. When construction finished on the first phase, the buildings stood ready, the streets were paved, and the fountains were installed. But few people moved in. The apartments were expensive for the local market. Many who could afford them already had homes in more central areas of Hangzhou. For most buyers, Tianducheng was a novelty rather than a necessity. Some purchased units as investments, expecting values to rise, but had no plans to live there. The location also worked against it. Tianducheng was about 20 kilometers from Hangzhou's main urban core. Public transport links were limited in the early years, making it inconvenient for commuting. Shops and restaurants were slow to open because there were not enough residents to support them. Without daily life filling the streets, the Paris-style setting felt more like a stage set after the actors had gone home. By the early 2010s, Tianducheng was gaining attention, but not for the reasons its developers had hoped. Foreign media labeled it a ghost city, showing images of empty squares and silent streets under the shadow of the fake Eiffel Tower. Videos circulated online of lone pedestrians walking through grand plazas without seeing another person. The contrast between the scale of the development and the lack of human activity became a symbol of overbuilding in parts of China. Yet the place was not completely abandoned. A small number of residents lived there, enjoying the peace and the open spaces. For them, the quiet streets and empty parks were a benefit rather than a flaw. A few businesses served the locals, and the Eiffel Tower replica became a minor tourist draw, especially for people from nearby areas who wanted photos with a European-style backdrop without leaving China. Wedding photographers in particular began using Tianducheng as a set, posing couples under the steel tower or along cobblestone streets. Over time, there were efforts to increase occupancy. New residential phases were built, sometimes at lower price points to attract more buyers. Hangzhou expanded its urban area, and better transport links made Tianducheng more accessible. As more people moved in, small grocery stores, cafes, and restaurants began to appear. The once empty plazas saw more activity, especially on weekends when visitors came to take photos. The Eiffel Tower replica remained the main landmark. At night, it was lit with colored lights, creating a striking scene against the skyline. Tourists from nearby cities came for day trips, often spending only a few hours but bringing some life to the streets. Social media helped spread images of the area, with users posting pictures that made Tianducheng look like it could be Paris at first glance. In some shots, the tower rose above tree-lined avenues with no visible Chinese signage, creating an illusion that fooled viewers unfamiliar with the place. Still, Tianducheng has never reached the level of density its original designers imagined. While more people live there now than in its early years, large sections remain quiet, and some buildings have limited use. The mix of real residents and staged spaces creates a unique atmosphere. On a weekday morning, you might see schoolchildren walking to a local primary school and elderly residents practicing Tai Chi in a park, while just a few streets away, grand apartment blocks stand with many windows dark at night. For those who live there, the city offers unusual scenery and open space compared to central Hangzhou. The architecture, while decorative, is not an exact copy of Paris. It blends French-style details with Chinese construction methods and materials. The Eiffel Tower replica is sturdy but scaled down, and the streets, though patterned after European boulevards, still follow local planning rules. This mix gives Tianducheng a layered identity. It is not truly Paris, but neither is it a typical Chinese development. From above, satellite images show its organized grid, the tower at the center, and the surrounding clusters of housing. The open plazas and wide roads stand out compared to denser Chinese neighborhoods. These same images reveal changes over time: more parked cars, more rooftop additions, and more greenery as trees mature. Such details hint at slow but steady growth in daily life. The tourism aspect remains important. For many visitors, the attraction is not to stay in Tianducheng, but to use it as a backdrop. Professional photographers and influencers stage shoots to mimic European scenes. Some even dress in Parisian fashion, creating carefully framed images that avoid modern signs or construction in the background. These photos travel widely online, sometimes surprising viewers who learn they were taken in China. Tianducheng's story sits at the intersection of urban planning, real estate speculation, and cultural imitation. It shows how developers in the 2000s sought to stand out in a crowded market by offering something exotic and themed. It also shows the risk of building faster than real demand, especially when relying on high-end buyers. The fantasy of Paris appealed to some, but not enough to fill the city overnight. For a visitor walking through today, the experience can shift from one block to another. Near the tower, the plazas may have groups of tourists, couples taking selfies, and vendors selling snacks. A few streets away, the scene might be quiet, with only a handful of residents going about their routines. This uneven rhythm makes Tianducheng different from either a fully active city or a truly abandoned place. It exists in between, slowly filling in over time, with its Eiffel Tower always in view, a steel reminder of the vision that began it all. Pripyat was once a new and growing Soviet city in northern Ukraine. Built in the 1970s, it was planned as a model town for workers at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It had wide streets, modern apartment blocks, schools, sports facilities, and cultural centers. The city was young in more ways than one. Most of its residents were under 40, and many families had small children. Stores were stocked with goods, buses ran on schedule, and people enjoyed the benefits of steady, well-paid work. The Ferris wheel in the amusement park had been assembled for the upcoming May Day celebrations. Pripyat was meant to show the success of Soviet planning. On April 26, 1986, that image ended. In the early hours, Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl plant exploded. Fires burned inside the structure, and a massive release of radioactive material began. At first, life in Pripyat continued almost as normal. Residents were told nothing about the accident. Some watched the glow from the reactor site, thinking it was a minor fire. Children played outside, and schools held classes. But radiation levels in the city were many times above safe limits. By the next day, authorities decided to evacuate everyone. Buses arrived in long lines. Loudspeakers told residents they would leave for only a few days and should pack light: documents, some food, and personal items. Most locked their apartments, expecting to return soon. Nearly 50,000 people left within hours. The city was emptied in a single afternoon. Pets were left behind. Meals sat half-eaten on tables. Laundry hung on balconies. No one came back to live there. The high radiation made Pripyat unsafe for habitation. Over time, the belongings of residents remained where they were, but the city itself began to change. Without maintenance, buildings started to decay. Windows broke in storms, paint peeled from walls, roofs leaked and collapsed. Books, toys, and furniture gathered dust. Rust spread over playground equipment. Nature began to take over. Trees and bushes grew in courtyards and along once busy streets. Grass pushed up through cracks in the pavement. Birds nested in abandoned apartments. Wild animals, including deer, foxes, and later wolves, moved into the area. The absence of human activity allowed ecosystems to expand quickly, even though radiation still lingered in the soil and plants. Inside buildings, the scene is often frozen in the moment of departure. Schoolrooms still have textbooks on desks. Gas masks, once stored for civil defense drills, lie scattered in piles. The swimming pool in the city's sports complex is empty, with tiles falling from the walls. The Ferris wheel stands unused, its yellow carriages faded and rusting. These details give the sense of time stopping in 1986. Pripyat became a symbol of the disaster. Photographers, journalists, and scientists documented its slow decay. For many years, access was strictly limited. The city lies within the Chernobyl exclusion zone, a 30-kilometer radius around the reactor where public entry is controlled. Researchers visited to study the effects of radiation on buildings, wildlife, and human-made environments. In the early 2000s, controlled tourism began. Visitors could join guided tours with permits, traveling from Kiev by bus. They would pass through security checkpoints at the zone's edge and be escorted by trained guides. Tours included stops at key locations: the main square, the amusement park, the swimming pool, and apartment blocks. Visitors were told to avoid touching surfaces, sitting on the ground, or eating outdoors, to limit contact with contaminated dust. These tours offered a rare chance to see a modern city left to nature. Many visitors described the experience as eerie. silence broken only by wind or distant bird calls, long empty streets, and the sense of an entire community missing. The city's clock towers still stand, but they no longer keep time. Road signs point to districts that have no residents. Guides explain that radiation levels vary from place to place. Some areas are relatively safe for short visits, while others remain dangerous for decades to come. Devices called dosimeters measure exposure during the tour. Safety rules are strict. Groups follow set paths, avoid unstable buildings, and spend limited time in higher radiation spots. For former residents, returning even for a short visit can be emotional. Some have come back with tour groups or on special memorial days. They walk through their old neighborhoods, recognizing buildings, but finding them empty and overgrown. The city they knew, full of life, with children playing and neighbors chatting, is gone. What remains is a skeleton of streets and structures. From above, satellite images show the changes clearly. Over the years, green areas have expanded into streets and open spaces. Roofs have collapsed, and some buildings are partially hidden by trees. The once clear grid of the city is now blurred by vegetation. This natural growth hides much of the decay from a distance, but up close the damage is visible. The disaster that emptied Pripyat was not just a local tragedy, but an international event. The radioactive cloud spread across Europe, and the accident changed how the world viewed nuclear safety. For Pripyat itself, the impact was total and permanent. The Soviet authorities built a new city, Slavutich, to house the evacuated population. Pripyat was left as it was, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Even today, decades later, the place stands as a rare example of an urban environment abandoned suddenly and left untouched except by time and weather. The pattern of life is still visible in the layout. Apartment blocks near schools, sports fields next to housing, a central square with administrative buildings. But the life itself is gone. On a quiet day, walking along a main street, you might hear leaves rustling, a bird calling, and the creak of an old sign in the wind. You could look up and see balconies where plants grow in what were once living rooms. You could step into a shop and find shelves still in place, the goods long removed or rotted away. Everything reminds you that the city was not abandoned because of slow decline, but in an instant, on a clear spring day in 1986, when buses lined the roads and loudspeakers told people they would be back soon. They never were. Hashima Island sits off the coast of Nagasaki in Japan. It is small, only a few hundred meters long, but in the mid-20th century, it was one of the most densely populated places on Earth. The island was built up around an undersea coal mine. Its outline, with concrete seawalls and block-like buildings, gave it the look of a warship from a distance. That resemblance earned it the nickname Gunkanjima, or Battleship Island. Coal was first mined there in the late 1800s. As demand grew, the mine expanded, and so did the structures above it. Space was limited, so the company built upward. Multi-story concrete apartment blocks rose close together, leaving narrow alleys in between. Workers and their families lived in small units with shared corridors and communal baths. By the 1950s, more than 5,000 people lived on the island, which was less than 1 square kilometer in area. The density meant everything was close: schools, a hospital, a cinema, shops, and even rooftop gardens. Life on Hashima revolved around the mine. Men worked long shifts underground, accessed by shafts that led deep below the seabed. Women often worked in service roles, running shops or preparing food. Children went to school within sight of the sea. Typhoons and storms sometimes battered the island, but its seawalls and sturdy buildings kept it secure. The close quarters created a tight community. Residents could cross from one side of the island to the other in minutes, passing familiar faces along the way. In the 1960s, Japan's energy needs began to change. Oil became a cheaper and more practical fuel than coal. Mines across the country closed as demand dropped. On Hashima, the decline was rapid. The coal seams were worked out, and the cost of mining outweighed the profit. In 1974, Mitsubishi, the company that owned the island, announced the mine would close. The residents were told to leave. Within months, the population went from thousands to none. The departure was sudden but orderly. People took their belongings, but much was left behind. Furniture, machinery, and personal items stayed in the buildings. Without maintenance, the island began to decay. Concrete cracked, roofs collapsed, and vegetation took root in unexpected places. The seawalls held, but the structures inside slowly gave way to wind, salt, and rain. For decades, Hashima was closed to the public. Boats passed by, and locals could see its outline from the mainland, but entry was forbidden. In this time, its abandoned state became part of its image. Photographers documented the empty buildings through telephoto lenses, and stories circulated about its eerie atmosphere. The island's compact, crumbling skyline made it a striking subject for anyone interested in urban decay. In 2009, part of the island reopened for guided tours. Visitors could walk along designated paths, seeing the outer blocks and parts of the seawall. Safety restrictions kept them from entering most of the buildings, which were unstable. From these paths, tourists could see the narrow alleys, the weathered concrete, and the remnants of everyday life: rusted railings, staircases leading nowhere, and the skeletal remains of apartment interiors. Hashima's visual impact also drew the attention of filmmakers. Its dense layout and weathered surfaces provided a ready-made set that looked both real and otherworldly. In 2012, the James Bond film Skyfall used it as inspiration for the villain's hideout. While the movie recreated the setting on a soundstage, the design closely matched the island's feel: tight passages, tall walls, and a sense of isolation surrounded by water. For those who lived there, the island holds mixed memories. Some remember a lively, self-contained world with neighbors close by and every need met within walking distance. Others recall the hard work and the physical limits of life in such a confined space. The mine's closure scattered the community, and returning years later means seeing familiar places overtaken by time and weather. Satellite images show how little space the island offers. Buildings cover nearly all of it, leaving only small open areas. The outer seawall creates a solid edge against the ocean, with the settlement packed tightly inside. From above, it is easy to see why the nickname Battleship stuck. The profile is low and long, with angular corners like a ship's hull. Over time, these images also reveal the collapse of roofs and the spread of green where plants have taken root. Visiting today means stepping into a fragment of industrial history. The concrete apartment blocks still stand, though many are hollow shells. The mine entrance is closed, but its location is marked by rusted equipment and overgrown pathways. Signs warn of unstable structures, and guides point out features from the island's peak years. The sound of waves against the seawall is constant, and the smell of salt air mixes with the faint scent of concrete dust. The density that once defined Hashima is still visible. Windows line up in tight rows, staircases rise abruptly between blocks, and corridors run straight from one end to the other. At its height, this arrangement allowed thousands of people to live and work in an area that could be crossed in less than 5 minutes. The design was practical for its time, shaped by necessity and the limits of the island's footprint. When storms roll in, the island can feel cut off from the world. Even in calm weather, the water around it reinforces its separation. The nearest mainland point is about 15 kilometers away, and from there the island's silhouette looks solid and compact, a dark shape against the horizon. Approaching by boat, the details emerge: broken windows, rusted balconies, and the uneven line of rooftops. Hashima's survival is due in part to its construction. The early use of reinforced concrete in its buildings made them resistant to typhoon damage, but decades without upkeep have worn them down. Cracks allow water to seep in, and winter freezes expand the damage. Some sections have been reinforced to allow safe tourism, but most remain off-limits, their interiors collapsing into piles of debris. The island's history has drawn attention beyond tourism and film. In 2015, it was listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site as part of Japan's Meiji-era industrial heritage. This brought both recognition and debate, as the site's history includes forced labor during World War II, when workers from Korea and China were brought to the mine under harsh conditions. Guides and exhibits now include this part of its story. Walking through the accessible areas today gives a glimpse of the contrasts: the grand scale of the mining operation and the small scale of personal life within it, the closeness of neighbors and the isolation from the mainland, the strength of the seawall and the fragility of the buildings inside. The island is both a monument to industrial achievement and a reminder of how quickly a place can empty when its purpose is gone. Villa Epecuén once stood on the shores of a salt lake in the Buenos Aires province of Argentina. Founded in the 1920s, it became a popular spa destination. The lake's mineral-rich waters were believed to have healing properties, attracting visitors from across the country and abroad. Hotels, guest houses, shops, and restaurants lined the streets. Trains brought tourists from Buenos Aires, and the small town swelled with life in summer. People bathed in the lake, which held so much salt that swimmers floated easily. The air smelled faintly of minerals, and the white crust along the shore reminded visitors of the sea, even though the ocean was far away. For decades, tourism kept Villa Epecuén thriving. Residents ran family businesses, guided visitors, and provided services for the crowds that came to relax. The town's economy revolved around the lake. It was both the reason the town existed and the source of its identity. But the same water that brought prosperity would later destroy it. In 1985, after weeks of heavy rain, the level of the lake began to rise. The water was held back by an earthen dam and a protective embankment. These had been built to manage seasonal changes in water level, but that year the rainfall was exceptional. The surrounding rivers swelled and the pressure on the dam increased. On November 10th, the embankment failed. Water poured into the town. At first, residents hoped it could be controlled. Pumps ran constantly, and barriers were reinforced. But the flood kept advancing. Streets turned into shallow channels. The lake, freed from its limits, spread across the low ground, carrying its salt with it. Within days, evacuation was ordered. People packed what they could and left, expecting to return when the water receded. But it never did. The lake continued to rise for years, swallowing homes, hotels, and public buildings. By 1993, the water stood more than 10 meters above the original lake level. Villa Epecuén lay completely submerged. Roofs, treetops, and power poles were all that remained visible above the surface. The salt water ensured that nothing would survive intact. Wood rotted quickly, metal corroded into flakes and dust. Concrete walls crumbled under the combined force of water and salt crystals forming inside them. The town became an underwater ruin, invisible except to those who remembered exactly where the streets had been. In the early 2000s, natural cycles began to reverse the flood. The lake level dropped slowly. Ruins started to reappear. First the tops of buildings, then entire structures coated in thick layers of white salt. Streets emerged, their surfaces cracked and buckled. Trees stood leafless, their trunks encased in salt like sculptures. Inside the buildings, furniture and personal items lay where they had been abandoned, but encrusted in crystalline deposits. The effect was otherworldly, as if the town had been frozen in mineral form. Photographers and journalists came to document the reemergence. The scene was stark, an entire town bleached by salt and sunlight, standing under a wide, empty sky. The air was dry, but the scent of minerals still hung in it. The silence was deep, broken only by the wind or the sound of footsteps crunching over salt-crusted ground. Among the people who returned was Pablo Novak, a former resident who had been in his 20s when the flood came. When the waters retreated enough to make the ruins accessible, he decided to move back. Novak repaired one surviving building, enough to make it livable, bringing in basic furniture and supplies. He became the sole resident of Villa Epecuén. While others came to visit for the day, he stayed year-round. Novak's presence gave the ghost town a living voice. He welcomed visitors, told stories of the town's past, and showed them what remained of its landmarks. He pointed out where hotels once stood, where the main street ran, and where the railway station had been. His own house before the flood had been destroyed, but he still walked the outlines of its foundation. For him, the ruins were not just a curiosity, but a map of memories. The salt made the ruins both fragile and striking. Walls that once held shops or homes now stood half-collapsed, their surfaces covered in white crystals. Old cars, rusted into skeletal frames, sat where they had been abandoned decades earlier. The lake's edge had receded, but seasonal rains could still bring water back into low areas, creating shallow pools that reflected the ruins. Tourism returned in a different form. People came not to bathe in the lake, but to see the remains of the drowned town. Photographers staged shoots among the skeletal trees. Filmmakers used the location for scenes needing a post-apocalyptic landscape. Historians and scientists visited to study how salt water affects human structures over decades. The town's story drew curiosity because it was both sudden and slow, a disaster that struck in days but took years to reveal its full impact. From above, satellite images show the town's grid faintly outlined in the pale remains of streets. The white of salt deposits contrasts with the darker soil beyond the lake's reach. This aerial view also reveals the scale of what was lost, entire neighborhoods reduced to lines and shapes in the mineral crust. Walking through Villa Epecuén today means moving between layers of time. The salt crust underfoot is a reminder of the flood, but the buildings still hold the shapes of their original purpose. You can stand in what was once a cafe and see where the counter ran, even though it is now a jagged edge of concrete. You can trace the outline of a hotel lobby, its tiled floor broken and warped. The school's walls still have faint traces of paint, but the classrooms are open to the sky. The lake itself is still there, but smaller. Its surface can be calm and reflective, with the ruins mirrored in it on still days. On windy days, the water ripples and flashes under the sun, the same salt that once drew tourists now marking every surface it touched. In dry weather, the air carries fine mineral dust, which clings to skin and clothes. For Novak, living among the ruins means accepting both isolation and routine. Supplies come from nearby towns. The nearest neighbors are kilometers away. His presence keeps Villa Epecuén from being entirely abandoned. He tends to his home, hosts the occasional visitor, and watches as the weather slowly continues to shape what remains. In the winter, frost forms on the salt, adding another layer of white. In the summer, heat bakes the ruins until the air shimmers. The return of Villa Epecuén above water did not bring back its life as a spa town, but it gave the place a second existence, as a preserved record of disaster and endurance. The salt has made it into something both harsh and beautiful, a place where the outlines of a community remain even after its people have gone. For those who knew it before 1985, the memory of streets filled with visitors and the smell of lake water on a summer day stands in contrast to the silence and whiteness that define it now. Bhangarh Fort lies in Rajasthan, India, near the edge of the Sariska Tiger Reserve. Built in the 16th century by Raja Bhagwant Das for his younger son, it was once part of a thriving settlement. The fort sits at the base of a hill, its walls enclosing palaces, temples, markets, and homes. In its prime, Bhangarh was prosperous, supported by agriculture in the surrounding plains and trade along local routes. The location was strategic, with the hills providing defense and a spring nearby supplying water. Over time, the population declined, and the settlement was abandoned. Today, only the stone ruins remain, open to the sun and wind. Roofs have collapsed, walls stand open to the sky, and trees grow through the foundations of old buildings. The fort's gates still mark the entrance to what was once a bustling town, but the noise of daily life is long gone. Bhangarh is as famous for its legends as for its history. The most well-known story speaks of a sorcerer who fell in love with a princess of Bhangarh. According to the tale, he tried to use magic to make her fall in love with him. She discovered the spell and threw it back at him, causing his death. With his last breath, the sorcerer is said to have cursed the city, dooming it to destruction and preventing its walls from ever being rebuilt. Not long after, the story says, an invading army attacked, and the city fell. Local guides tell this story to visitors, often with added details. Some say anyone who tries to live within the fort will meet misfortune. Others claim strange sounds can be heard at night, footsteps, music, or voices, though the site stands empty. The myth has made Bhangarh one of India's most talked-about haunted places, and it attracts both history enthusiasts and people curious about the supernatural. Archaeologists, however, point to more practical explanations. They suggest that Bhangarh's decline was due to resource shortages, political changes, or conflict. The location, while defensible, may have been vulnerable to drought, as water from the nearby spring could not sustain a large population in dry years. Shifts in trade routes could also have reduced the town's importance. Evidence from excavations shows the settlement followed the patterns of other fortified towns in the region, with no proof of a sudden supernatural event. The ruins themselves match the layout of a planned city. The main gate opens to a large market street lined with shopfronts. Temples stand on raised platforms, their carvings still visible in places. The palace complex rises toward the hill with multiple levels and courtyards. The walls, though broken in sections, still trace the outline of the old defenses. The size and quality of the stonework suggest the town was built to last, but centuries of weather and neglect have taken their toll. What keeps the myth alive is the atmosphere. The fort is surrounded by scrubland, and the hills rise steeply behind it. In the late afternoon, as shadows lengthen, the empty structures can seem more imposing. The silence is deep, broken only by the wind or bird calls. Visitors often describe a feeling of stepping back in time, as if the life of the town had simply paused. The Indian government has placed a restriction on visiting the site after dark. The Archaeological Survey of India, which manages the fort, has posted signs warning that entry is prohibited between sunset and sunrise. The official reason is safety. The ruins are unstable, the terrain is uneven, and wildlife from the nearby reserve sometimes wanders in. But the ban has also fed the legends, with some seeing it as proof that the place is dangerous after nightfall. During the day, Bhangarh sees steady numbers of tourists. Some come to photograph the temples and palaces, focusing on the architectural details, arches, carved stone, and the symmetry of the layout. Others come for the stories, hoping to feel something unusual. Vendors outside the gate sell snacks, drinks, and trinkets, and local guides offer to explain both the history and the myths. Standing in the marketplace, you can imagine it in its prime. Stalls shaded with cloth, goods from nearby villages and distant towns, the noise of bargaining and conversation. Walking toward the palace, you pass temples that still hold traces of color in their stone. Climbing higher, the view opens to the plains beyond, showing the farmland that once supported the town. From the top levels of the palace, the settlement's defensive logic is clear. The walls follow the contour of the land, and the gates are positioned to control entry. Inside, courtyards and living quarters are arranged for both privacy and access. In its day, Bhangarh would have been well protected and well supplied. But without its people, the fort is only a shell. Grass grows between the stones of the market street. Birds nest in cracks in the walls. The palace halls echo with the sound of footsteps on empty floors. Whether one believes in the curse or not, the effect of standing in such a place is strong. The combination of history, ruin, and legend gives Bhangarh its particular character. Satellite images show the fort's outline clearly against the surrounding landscape. The rectangular plan of the walls encloses the remains of streets and buildings, with the hill pressing in from one side. From above, the site looks orderly, almost geometric, even though on the ground it feels overgrown and scattered. For some, the myths add to the fort's appeal. For others, the reality of a centuries-old settlement, abandoned and left to the elements, is compelling enough. Bhangarh's mix of fact and legend ensures that it remains a place where history and story meet, and where the line between them is not always clear. Poveglia Island sits in the Venetian lagoon between Venice and Lido. To visitors in passing boats, it looks like a small, quiet patch of green. The water laps at crumbling walls, and trees cover much of its surface. Beneath that calm appearance is a history tied to disease, death, and despair. The island has earned the name Island of the Dead because of its role during the plague and its later life as an asylum. In the late 1700s, Venice faced recurring outbreaks of the plague. The disease spread quickly, killing thousands, and the city needed places to keep the sick away from the healthy. Poveglia became one of these plague quarantine stations, or lazarettos. Ships suspected of carrying infections stopped there before entering the city. Crew and passengers had to stay on the island for a set time. Those who showed symptoms received no treatment that could save them. The sick died on the island, far from home, and their bodies were burned in large pits. Historical accounts and local stories say that thousands of corpses were reduced to ash in this way. Some suggest that the soil of the island still contains high amounts of human remains. Quarantine rules were strict. Guards kept watch to prevent anyone from escaping. If someone tried to swim to safety, they risked drowning in the lagoon or being brought back by force. Imagine arriving on a merchant ship after weeks at sea, hearing the bells of Venice in the distance, yet being told you could not go ashore. If you developed a fever during your stay, you would be moved to the area where the dying lay. The smell of smoke from burning bodies would mix with the salty air. Survivors left the island changed, having seen many die around them. After the worst waves of plague passed, the island remained tied to illness and isolation. In the late 1800s, the buildings were adapted into an asylum for the mentally ill. The asylum stood there for decades, hidden from the view of most Venetians. Treatment methods of the time often reflected misunderstanding of mental health. Patients might be kept in locked rooms for long periods. Records mention experiments and crude surgeries. One story describes a doctor who performed lobotomies using tools such as hammers and drills. Local legends claim he went mad himself and died after falling from the hospital's bell tower. Whether this is fact or embellishment, it reflects the fear and suspicion people had toward the place. Life inside the asylum would have been harsh. Imagine narrow hallways with peeling paint, barred windows, and the echo of footsteps on stone floors. At night, the wind from the lagoon would rattle shutters and carry sounds across the water. Patients, some already confused or distressed, might have felt trapped not only by the walls, but by the island itself. Staff lived and worked there, separated from the mainland except by boat. Supplies had to be ferried in, and bad weather could cut off the island for days. The asylum eventually closed in the mid-20th century, leaving the buildings empty. Without upkeep, nature began to reclaim the structures. Roofs collapsed in places, ivy climbed the walls, and wooden doors rotted. The bell tower still rises above the trees, a landmark visible from surrounding waters. Locals say the island is cursed or haunted. They talk of strange noises, shadows moving in empty rooms, and voices carried on the wind. Fishermen avoid casting nets too close to its shore. Tourists on passing boats sometimes ask about it, and guides give short, careful answers. The haunted reputation of Poveglia is strengthened by the way it looks today. The air feels heavy when you step onto the island. Paths are overgrown, and debris lies in corners where walls have collapsed. In some rooms, old furniture and rusted hospital equipment remain. The isolation adds to the unease. Even in daylight, the thick trees block much of the sun. When the tide is low, blackened posts stick up from the water, remnants of old docks. Archaeologists and historians confirm its role in plague control and as a medical site. The mass burials are part of the official record. During construction in parts of the Venetian lagoon, workers have found layers of ash mixed with human bone. On Poveglia, the concentration would have been even greater. Some soil tests suggest that parts of the island's ground are made up of a mix of earth and cremated remains. These details help explain why the island's history is so difficult to separate from its legends. The lagoon's environment plays a role in preserving this atmosphere. The water is shallow in many places, and tides shift sand and silt around the island. In winter, fog can blanket the area, hiding the shore from view until a boat is almost upon it. In summer, the air is hot and still, with the hum of insects replacing the distant ring of church bells from Venice. These conditions feed the sense of being removed from the rest of the world. For anyone stranded here centuries ago, that sense of isolation would have been absolute. There are records of people trying to use the island after the asylum closed. Some proposals involved turning it into a public park or a resort. None succeeded, often because the cost of removing hazardous materials and restoring buildings was too high. Locals were also wary of working there. Over time, the island was left alone, its buildings continuing to decay. Windows gape like empty sockets, and the brick walls show deep cracks. Wooden floors have rotted through in many places, making exploration dangerous. Standing on Poveglia, you can trace the layers of its past. You might walk past the remains of a barracks where plague patients once slept, then see the shell of a hospital ward where asylum inmates were kept. The bell tower, older than much of the other architecture, still casts its shadow across both. It is easy to picture guards patrolling the edge of the island centuries ago, or nurses carrying supplies along narrow paths. The same water that carried ships from distant ports still surrounds the island, keeping it apart. Today, the Venetian government restricts access. It is not open for casual visits, and permission is hard to obtain. This keeps most people at a distance, their view limited to what they can see from a boat. For many, that is enough. The sight of broken buildings and the knowledge of what happened there combine to create an image that lingers. In that way, Poveglia continues to serve as a reminder of the city's past struggles with disease, isolation, and the limits of care. The Sathorn Unique Tower rises above the streets of Bangkok, a concrete frame against the skyline. It was meant to be one of the city's most striking luxury residential skyscrapers. Its design included sweeping balconies, high ceilings, and views of the Chao Phraya River. Construction began in the early 1990s, during a period when Thailand's economy was growing quickly and foreign investment was pouring into the city. Developers and architects planned the tower as a symbol of modern Bangkok, catering to wealthy buyers and promising a lifestyle that combined height, space, and prestige. By 1997, the tower stood partially complete. Floors had been poured, stairwells built, and much of the outer structure was in place. Then the Asian financial crisis struck. The Thai baht lost much of its value in a short period. Construction loans became impossible to pay back. Real estate projects across the country stopped overnight. The Sathorn Unique Tower was one of the casualties. The developer went bankrupt, investors pulled out, and work crews never returned. What remained was a 49-story skeleton, solid in shape but empty of life. In the years that followed, the unfinished tower became part of the city's landscape. Bangkok continued to grow around it, with new buildings rising while the Sathorn Unique remained frozen in time. Rainwater pooled on unfinished floors. Birds nested in open beams, the exposed concrete weathered under the sun and monsoon rains. Metal fixtures rusted, and glass panes meant for windows were never installed. From the outside, it was clear the building had been abandoned before its interiors could be fitted. For many locals, the tower came to represent the sudden collapse of ambition. People remembered how confident developers had been in the early 1990s. Apartments in the building had been marketed with images of polished marble, imported furniture, and modern amenities. The abrupt halt of construction showed how quickly fortunes could change. In conversations, it became a shorthand for the financial crash itself, a monument to plans that never came to pass. The structure also drew the attention of urban explorers. Bangkok has many old and unused buildings, but few match the size and visibility of the Sathorn Unique. Adventurers looking for an unusual experience began to slip through gaps in fences or use ladders to reach open entry points. Inside, they found dark stairwells, open elevator shafts, and empty rooms with bare concrete floors. Some floors still contained construction debris, bags of cement hardened into lumps, tiles stacked but never laid, and rolls of electrical wire that had long since lost their use. Climbing to the top offered a panoramic view of the city, the river winding through high-rises, temples, and streets. For explorers, reaching the upper floors became a kind of challenge, a way to see Bangkok from a perspective few others had. The climb was not without risk. Missing railings, loose flooring, and sheer drops made certain areas dangerous. Some explorers wore headlamps and gloves, treating the ascent as they would a trek through a cave or mountain path. Stories of ghosts began to attach themselves to the building. In Thai culture, unfinished buildings are sometimes thought to house restless spirits. Rumors spread that workers had died during construction or that the site's abrupt abandonment left it spiritually unsettled. Some visitors claimed to have heard footsteps in empty corridors or felt sudden drops in temperature. A few said they saw shadowy figures near the stairwells. While such accounts are difficult to prove, they added to the tower's notoriety. The ghost stories blended with the building's appearance to create an atmosphere that felt unsettling to some. Imagine walking through a vast, hollow space where every sound echoes, a dropped piece of metal clanging down a shaft, the wind whistling through unfinished windows. In daylight, shafts of sunlight cut through the dust, highlighting graffiti on the walls. At night, the building becomes a dark silhouette, its empty balconies like rows of watching eyes. At times, security guards were stationed to keep people out. Developers still held rights to the building. and there were occasional talks of restarting construction or demolishing the structure. Each plan faced the same challenges: the cost of bringing it up to modern safety codes, the expense of removing degraded materials, and the need for new investors willing to take on a site with a mixed reputation. As a result, the tower stayed as it was, drawing only occasional maintenance or inspections. For urban explorers, the appeal lay in its mix of scale, height, and history. Standing on a mid-level balcony, you could see the expressway curve toward the river, the traffic below reduced to moving dots of light at night. Higher up, the city spread out like a map, temples with golden roofs catching the sun alongside clusters of glass office towers. Photographers captured these views, often framing them against the raw concrete of the unfinished floors. Some shots became widely shared online, further spreading the building's fame. Inside, traces of the original luxury vision could still be found. Molded concrete patterns hinted at where decorative panels would have been placed. Large window openings suggested living rooms meant to take in sweeping views. On certain floors, tiled areas marked where swimming pools or gyms had been planned. The contrast between these hints of design and the reality of abandonment made the building a physical record of interrupted ambition. The tower's central stairwell was one of the main routes explorers used to move between floors. Wide enough for two people to walk side by side, it spiraled upward, each landing offering a glimpse into the empty space beyond. Graffiti ranged from simple tags to elaborate murals, some of them referencing the ghost stories linked to the building. In one corner, melted candles and incense sticks suggested that someone had performed a ritual there, perhaps to ward off bad spirits or pay respect to the dead. Weather played a part in shaping the building's current state. Heavy rains during the wet season left puddles and slick patches inside. The heat during dry months baked the concrete, giving parts of it a pale, almost bleached look. Wind carried dust and leaves into the open spaces, collecting them in drifts along the edges. Birds flew freely through the upper levels, nesting in spots where steel rods jutted from the walls. The building's location in the Sathorn district kept it visible to both residents and visitors. Office workers could see it from nearby towers, its unfinished bulk, a constant reminder of the economic events that had shaped the city. Taxi drivers sometimes pointed it out to passengers, calling it the Ghost Tower. Tour boats on the river passed within sight of its balconies. Even without stepping inside, people recognized it as something apart from the polished developments around it. When the financial crisis hit, many projects stopped, but most were eventually completed or replaced. Sathorn Unique remained in place because it was too far along to demolish cheaply and too costly to finish. That in-between state, neither fully alive nor entirely gone, has lasted for decades. Its height and location ensure it will not be forgotten. From the street, its repeating balconies give it a rhythm that is both orderly and empty. From inside, the scale of the unused space can make a visitor feel both small and exposed, as if walking through a frame meant to hold something that never arrived. Empty cities are more than silent streets and dark windows. They are physical records of plans, ambitions, and mistakes. Urban planners, economists, and historians study them because they reveal how cities grow, how they fail, and what those changes mean for the people connected to them. An empty city can form when development outpaces demand, when disasters strike, or when political or economic shifts change migration patterns. Each cause leaves its own trace in the layout, infrastructure, and surviving buildings. From an urban planning perspective, an abandoned or half-built city is a lesson in scale and timing. A new district might be designed for a future population that never arrives. Roads, power lines, and water systems are laid out to serve thousands, yet only a few hundred people move in. The cost of maintaining these services falls on a small tax base, and buildings begin to decay before they are even fully used. Imagine a vast housing development with wide boulevards, streetlights, and parks, but only a handful of cars and residents. Without enough people, the planned economy of the place cannot function. Shops stay closed, public transport runs empty, and the absence of activity discourages newcomers. Economics often plays the central role. Cities depend on investment, jobs, and steady growth to keep them alive. If an economy shifts suddenly through a market crash, A drop in a key industry or loss of government support, construction stops and migration reverses. This can happen on a small scale, like a mining town shutting down after the mine closes, or on a large scale, such as when an entire urban project fails to attract expected industries. In both cases, physical structures remain as markers of halted growth. The psychology of abandonment is another part of the picture. People respond strongly to places that have been left behind. Walking through a street with empty houses, weeds pushing through cracks in the pavement, and doors swinging open in the wind creates a sense of unease. Human spaces are designed to be used, and when they are not, they feel incomplete. This reaction is partly practical. The signs of neglect suggest danger, lack of resources, or social breakdown. It is also emotional. A place that was once full of life, but is now silent, forces people to think about loss, change, and the passage of time. Abandonment can also shape the identity of the people who remain. In some towns, a shrinking population develops strong ties to the location, resisting calls to leave. They maintain buildings, hold community events, and adapt unused spaces for new purposes. In others, the remaining residents feel cut off, watching familiar shops close and schools shut down. The built environment reflects these changes. A single occupied house surrounded by derelict structures tells a story about resilience and isolation. Cultural fascination with ruins and forgotten places has deep roots. Ancient ruins like Pompeii or Machu Picchu draw visitors because they offer a glimpse into past lives. Modern ruins provoke a similar curiosity, though their histories are closer in time. People want to know why a once busy place was left to decay. Photographers, filmmakers, and writers use these spaces to explore themes of memory, impermanence, and the relationship between humans and their environment. A derelict factory might be the backdrop for a documentary on industrial decline. An empty shopping mall can serve as a set for a story about changing consumer habits. Urban explorers seek out these spaces for the experience of seeing what most people cannot. They climb through broken windows, cross floors covered in debris, and capture images of peeling paint, rusted machinery, and nature reclaiming walls. This activity can raise questions about safety, legality, and preservation. Some argue that documenting abandoned spaces preserves a form of history that would otherwise disappear. Others see it as trespassing that risks further damage to already fragile sites. Governments and developers sometimes try to reuse or repurpose empty cities. A failed residential area might be turned into a tourist destination, a filming location, or an industrial zone. Success depends on cost, demand, and public perception. If a place is seen as unsafe or unlucky, it can be hard to attract new investment. In some cases, demolition is the most practical choice, clearing land for something completely different. In others, gradual occupation and adaptation breathe life back into the existing structures. Empty cities also have value as warning systems. They show what happens when growth is pushed without regard for long-term sustainability. They reveal the limits of central planning when it does not match local needs. They highlight the risks of building economies on a single resource or market. In studying these places, planners and policymakers can design systems that are more flexible, less dependent on one factor, and better able to adapt to change. The scale of abandonment changes how it feels and functions. A single empty building in a city might draw little notice. An entire neighborhood left vacant becomes a visible wound in the urban fabric. A whole city without residents can feel like a stage set after the actors have left. The sound of your own footsteps echoes off the walls. Street signs point to destinations that no longer exist. Even in daylight, shadows seem longer when no one is there to break them. In some cultures, these spaces take on spiritual or supernatural meanings. Folklore may grow around them, with stories of ghosts, curses, or bad luck tied to the site. This can influence how people use the area or whether they avoid it entirely. Such beliefs may seem separate from urban planning, but they can affect redevelopment decisions as much as financial factors. Natural forces interact with abandonment over time. Plants push through asphalt, roots crack walls, and rain erodes surfaces. Animals move in, from birds nesting in rafters to larger species finding shelter. Over decades, an empty city can shift from a human-centered space to a hybrid environment where built and natural elements blend. This transformation can attract scientists studying urban ecology, adding another layer of interest to the site. When looking at an empty city, you are seeing more than a collection of structures. You are seeing the results of choices, events, and forces that shaped it. You are seeing how the physical form of a place reacts when people no longer maintain it. You are seeing how absence changes the meaning of space, both for those who once lived there and for those who encounter it later. In that sense, empty cities act as open books, waiting for someone to read the story written into their streets and walls.